Thanks so much, Michael. Hey everyone, it's great to be back. We are continuing in our series called Now What, where we're exploring the emotions that we're experiencing through this COVID time and just how our faith and our Jesus following informs what we're experiencing in this time. So if you're just tuning in for the first time, we want to welcome you. And just so you know, each week is a standalone, so you'll be able to track with us, no problem. I have a question for you. Have you ever been lost? I mean, really lost. Do you recall a time in your childhood where you were at the zoo or the CNE and you looked up only to see a sea of legs and none of them looked like your parents? Or perhaps more recently, you've been lost in IKEA. Now there's a place that we can easily be lost. It's actually a fact that most people fear being lost. It appears to be hardwired into our human brain, and it evokes as visceral a response as our response to snakes or killer hornets or public speaking. There was a commission done in 2002 that found that folklore, fairy tales, and horror films have taken this toll on our collective psyche in such a way that we genuinely are terrified of being lost. Our modern fairy tales feature children being lost in the woods as much as ancient mythology does. So even as we have progressed as a civilization from ancient times into modern times, this fear of being lost is still embedded. We've not outgrown that. But feeling lost doesn't mean being lost. I lived in Toronto for 4 years, and I lived in a constant state of feeling lost, whether I was trying to navigate the transit system, the road system, or that underground labyrinth called the Path. And I remember this one time I went to meet a friend there. She had an office in the Path, in one of the office towers, and there are banks and banks and banks of elevators. What I didn't realize is that they don't all go to the same floors. And there I was standing trying to find an elevator to reach her floor, and people are bustling about. They know exactly where they're going. I didn't. I stood there on the verge of tears, feeling disoriented, feeling stupid, and feeling very, very lost. But I wasn't ever really lost. I knew I was in Toronto. I had my cell phone. I could call Steve or 911 or anyone at any time if I was truly in crisis. But I was struggling to find my destination, to figure out where I was in relation to where I needed to be, or in fact, where I had just come from. But I wasn't lost. I just felt lost. It's a bit like walking for miles in the forest and realize you've come back to the same place. That was my life in this city. I felt like I was constantly walking in circles and everything looked the same. But feeling lost doesn't mean being lost. Few of us actually get lost. And yet it doesn't really matter, does it? Because feeling lost eclipses the reality of not being lost. We get this sense of frustration, this sense of helplessness and loss of control. And then, of course, you can be lost and not feel lost. There are those among us, and I won't mention who they usually are, who won't stop for directions, whether it's in a mall or on a road trip, even though all of the data points to the fact that we have indeed circled back to the same store or the same tree or the same location over and over again, and yet not arrived at our destination. And I'll leave it to you to decide which one of those describes you or your significant other. But to be lost is a dreadful thing. It's a documented reality that people really do circle back to the same place over and over. It doesn't just happen in movies. It's a neurological mystery of the human brain. In 2013, a hiking enthusiast, Jerry Larget, set out to hike the Appalachian Mountain Trail, 3,300 kilometers. She was an avid hiker. She had done her research, trained for the trek, planned her resupply stops. She had regular places where she would meet up with her husband, who was following along on the road, driving. Everything went perfectly well until it didn't. Until one day, she did as she always did. She ventured 80 paces off the path to go to the bathroom and was never seen alive again. Only 80 steps from the path, and she became disoriented. and unable to find her way back, losing her fixed point of reference. Because you see, here's the thing. Without a fixed point of reference, we drift. People who have been lost attest to this extraordinarily powerful impulse to flee, to keep moving, to run. And it's extremely hard to resist, even for the most seasoned of navigators. It's this psychological effect of flight, where freeze would be the safer option. Or as one kids' survival camp slogan goes, hug a tree and survive. Keep that fixed point of reference. A psychologist from Nova Scotia studied the behavior of lost people, because maybe you didn't know this, but Nova Scotia is the lost person capital of North America. And he said this, he said, lost is a cognitive state. Your internal map, how you envision things should be, becomes detached from the external world, how things actually are. And nothing in your spatial memory matches what you see. But at its core, it's an emotional state. Not only are you stricken with fear, you also lose your ability to reason, because fear does that. We suffer what one neuroscientist calls a hostile takeover of consciousness by emotion. A hostile takeover of consciousness by emotion. Now, I don't think you have to be lost to experience that. But here we are, stuck in the midst of this pandemic. Nothing that any of us has ever experienced before. Our internal map of how we envision things should be, how we do life, has become detached from the external world, how things actually are. Nothing in our spatial memory matches what we see. And we're in this emotional state of lostness. There's been this hostile takeover of consciousness by emotion. Many of us have lost our fixed points of reference, our daily rhythms, our work, the identity quotient that was met by our jobs and our exercise routines, the emotional quotient that was met by date nights, movie nights, coffee with friends, the spiritual quotient that was met when we enjoyed our Sunday gatherings and our midweek connection times. And you couple that with the uncertainty of the future in every area, and we feel lost. We feel untethered from who we were. Who are we anymore? And maybe you wake up in the morning and you wander in circles, wondering what to do first, where to start your day. Or maybe you struggle just to get out of bed, because really, what's there to get out of bed for? Because nothing is familiar, even though everything looks the same. And we're completely disoriented. You're not only lost, you're not really lost, but you're struggling to find your way. And at the end of the day, the outcome for Jerry Large was the same. Her body was eventually found a half mile from the trail. The urge to run, to flee, to keep going superseded the wisdom of hug a tree and survive. Keep your eyes on a fixed point of reference. And we find ourselves wandering and circling and disoriented, even if we're super busy trying to keep home life together, because nothing is familiar, even though everything looks the same. And I found myself searching scripture, wondering what wisdom, what purpose there is for those who feel lost during this time. Where is God in the disorientation, in the lostness? And I don't mean I was looking for a verse necessarily of here and there, although that can be helpful. What I'm looking for is wisdom from scripture, purpose, direction in the midst of lostness. What do we do in these perilous times of disorientation, of feeling lost? Where do we turn? The path is unfamiliar, and we don't know our way out. And even if you're not feeling lost, you're surrounded by people who are. A whole world, a society, maybe even your children are feeling lost and disoriented, purposeless. For many, those roles and relationships and responsibilities on which our identities hung, our purpose for being relied, have been ripped away. What do we do when our internal map, how we think things should be, becomes detached from our external world, how things actually are? When there are no distinguishing features in a day or even a week for that matter, when there's been a hostile takeover of consciousness by emotion, when nothing is familiar, but everything looks the same. There's this story that's buried in the annals of the Hebrew Bible that can give us some clues, some hope that we haven't actually lost our point of reference. That in fact, although we may feel lost, we're not actually lost. What may look like peril is actually an opportunity. It's an account of a nobody from nowhere, the greatest messenger of God prior to Jesus. In fact, when people were in awe of Jesus' teaching, they often mused to themselves, wondering, could this be that messenger come back to life? But he started out as a nobody from a backwoods town in Israel. Now, in ancient times, God would commission certain people as messengers who would tell the king or the people what he wanted them to know. And it was usually a corrective because they often wandered away from God. They often wandered away from their fixed point of reference. And they ended up being lost and mixed up in the belief systems and cultures and idolatries of surrounding nations that were often violent and depraved. Many times they ended up in bondage to them, even sacrificing their own children on the altar of their beliefs. And Elijah was one of these messengers who lived during one of these times. And king after king had led the people into disgusting practices of Baal worship. And at the time of Elijah, the particular version of Baal worship that was in vogue was extremely sexually depraved and violent, even by pagan standards. They were truly lost, and yet they didn't feel lost. And Elijah was incensed. He was incensed at this licentious idolatry that had infected his nation, that had caused the murder of thousands and thousands of his people, most of whom were now in hiding. And he did the only thing he could do. I mean, he was a nobody from nowhere. He was powerless. He prayed. He prayed earnestly. He prayed with dogged perseverance. And he prayed a very weird prayer. He prayed that it wouldn't rain for 3 years. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not generally my go-to prayer. But he prayed even though it would cause his own suffering. He too would be experiencing the hardship of famine, of what it would be like to have a shortage of food and no water due to the absence of rain. But he knew that hardship often brings people back to God. It brings them back to a fixed point of reference. And so he prayed. He prayed at his own expense. He prayed for their sakes. And then he delivered the news to the king. It would not rain for 3 years. So you can imagine how furious King Ahab was. So much so that he wanted Elijah murdered. And so God directs him for his own safety to go to the outback, the wilderness, a desert ravine called Tirith. And that's where we pick up the story. It's in 1 Kings 17. And I'll be reading from the New Living Translation, and it'll actually be on your screen. This is what God told Elijah to do. Go to the east and hide by Tirith brook, near where it enters the Jordan River. Drink from the brook and eat what the ravens bring you, for I've commanded them to bring you food. Hide yourself, God instructed Elijah. Now, I'd like you to grab a piece of paper or your phone or whatever it is you take notes on and write down the word Tirith, Kerith, and we're going to return to that later. This is a story that's soaked in irony and humor. Tirith is a seasonal brook. It only runs in the rainy season. And now there's going to be 3 years with no rain. There aren't going to be any rainy seasons And ravens are scavenging birds. It's where we get our word ravenous. And yet God had commanded a brook and ravens to provide the nourishment that Elijah needed. Unreliable sources is what God was going to use as provision. It's laughable. It's completely laughable. There he was, receiving home delivery in isolation in the wilderness from two very unreliable sources. Here he is in this obscure and remote place, and God was going to provide for his needs. God promised to provide for his needs. And that's all well and good. He's got a full belly, but an empty day. There's nothing to do in the wilderness. There's no work, no friends, no family, no Netflix, no purpose. He's alone with himself and he's alone with God. Elijah knew where he was, but he felt utterly lost. There was nothing familiar, and yet everything looked the same, day in and day out. And many of you know this acutely. You awake each new day to a mundane, repetitive, dull sameness. You know where you are, but you feel utterly lost. And Elijah knew where he was, but he was completely unsure of how long he would be there, what the purpose of being there was, and to what end. Tirith was a place filled with emptiness, but it was the place of soul making. Tirith was a place of soul making because it was a place of dependence. It was a place of soul making because it was a place of preparation. It was here that Elijah learned that to be at the mercy of God is actually the best place to be. Daily he depended on God for dinner, and daily God provided. And every day as he learned to wait on God for food, God was feeding his soul. Tirith is a test of our faith. Perhaps it's the making of our faith. God had sent Elijah here with no further instructions, no roadmap to the future, no next steps, no end date. Elijah was to wait. That's all he could do, wait and pray. Yuck. That's all I can come up with. I don't know about you, but I'm way more comfortable doing something, taking control, busying myself, having a plan, making a list and checking it twice, having a to-do list that I can check off at the end of the day, achieving and accomplishing something. And I don't know if you've ever done this, but sometimes you come to the end of the day and you go back to your list and you actually add things to the list that you've already done just so that you can check them off. I know. I have issues, but I love to see that finished list at the end of the day, to feel the satisfaction of having accomplished something, of having had purpose. You see, I need purpose in my day. And friends, you need purpose in your day because we were created for purpose. But Elijah was to spend that time alone, in isolation, with himself and with God. Imagine the soul searching that must have gone on in that time. Or maybe you don't have to imagine. Maybe you're living it. Once upon a time, we may have read this and thought, oh, how nice. A few weeks alone at a divine spa with room service. But now we've tasted isolation, haven't we? We've tasted the wilderness. We've tasted the desert. And we know what it is to be alone with ourselves and to be alone with other people who are alone with themselves in isolation. It's growing, it's stretching, it's a disorienting and perhaps disrupting experience. But was he in hiding or in preparation? Was he in isolation or soul school? You see, intimacy with God isn't a 10-step process. It can't be acquired on a weekend retreat or through a correspondence course. It is God working in us. And it always happens in the hidden places, in the secret places. Tirith is our hidden place. And perhaps COVID is our Tirith, our hidden place, our soul school. Not because God sent it, but because God will redeem it. Hear me say that again. Not because God sent it, but because God will redeem it. In the midst of isolation, of loneliness, of confusion and disorientation, God was up to something new. One author wrote this: perilous times are times of unparalleled opportunity. Those who know God mustn't fear them. Rather, they should buy them up. It's a shift in perspective, isn't it? Is this hiding or preparation? Is this isolation or soul school? When Elijah felt alone, God was present. When Elijah was in a place of ultimate weakness, God was there in power and provision. When Elijah felt lost, God was his fixed point of reference. This isn't the end of Elijah's story. We're not going to cover that today. This is just the beginning. God eventually sends him on a mission that's going to bring the whole nation of Israel back to God. It's going to end in the demise of a wicked monarchy. But it didn't start there. Elijah will become known as the greatest messenger ever in the history of Israel. But first, God was preparing him, being a guide in the midst of lostness, in the midst of his obscurity and isolation, his boredom and mundanity. God proved to be Elijah's fixed point of reference. When we feel lost, we go in circles, making no progress, moving further and further from our destination, further and further from the trail. We all need a fixed point of reference. Jerry Large was ready for the trail, but she wasn't prepared for the wilderness. She wasn't prepared for the disorientation beyond the familiar path. And few people ever are. You could argue that she wasn't actually lost. She was only 80 steps from the trail. It was right there. But she'd lost her fixed point of reference. She wandered further and further from her destination, further from safety, right into the clutches of death. I was never lost in Toronto, but I was often disoriented. And yet at the end of the day, it all feels the same. And if you're someone who is wandering around during this COVID time, wondering if there's anything to faith or to God, I'd love to invite you into this Jesus-following life. Not because we have all the answers, not because we have the solution all tied up neatly, the directions or the route, but we do have a fixed point of reference, and that's Jesus. So can I assure you that if you are in a place of feeling lost, like if you're wandering aimlessly through life, aimlessly through the day, aimlessly through a landscape where nothing is familiar, and yet everything looks the same, this can be your Tirith, your place of preparation, your place of soul making, your place of discovering a fixed point of reference for your life. Will you text us? We'd love to hear from you, to walk with you, to join you in navigating your Tirith. And for a moment, I want to speak to those of you who consider yourself Jesus followers. This COVID time is a moment in time where God is refining and redefining us. A time when God is doing a new thing. He's birthing new life from dead soil. This time may, in fact, be our Tirith, where our nourishment comes from an unlikely source in an unprecedented manner. This time may be a test of our faith or a making of our faith. It's a time where God is remaking us. He's preparing us for something we don't yet see, something we can't even begin to imagine. Will we lean into this time, embrace the discomfort of uncertainty, and fix our eyes on Jesus? Embrace the discomfort of uncertainty? Will we lean into prayer? Perilous times are times of unparalleled opportunity. Those who know God mustn't fear them. Rather, they should buy them up. Will we buy this up? Will we seize this moment? I believe that God is preparing us, church. He's preparing us. This time and this place is a time and place of soul making. And I'd like to invite you into an imaginary dialogue between a person and God as we close. And maybe you could put yourself in the place of the person. Maybe this is you in conversation with God. But if you're not struggling in these days, if you're not struggling with isolation or lostness, and you're a part of a faith community, could I ask you to engage this conversation as God conversing with the church, speaking to the church, because I believe that this can apply to us individually or as a community of faith. Now, I apologize, both Morgan Freeman and James Earl Jones were not available to play the role of God today. So I'm going to have to step in, unfortunately. Haven't you always wanted to play the role of God? This is a dialogue, a conversation with God. You can close your eyes. You can engage with this however it's most comfortable for you. Hey, God. Hello. I'm falling apart. Can you put me back together? I'd rather not. But why? Because you aren't a puzzle. But what about all the pieces of my life that are falling down onto the ground? Just let them stay there for a while. They fell off for a reason. Take some time and decide if you need any of those pieces back. But you don't understand. I'm breaking down. No, you don't understand. You're breaking through. What you're feeling are just growing pains. You're shedding the things and the people in your life that are holding you back. You aren't falling apart. You're falling into place. So relax. Take some deep breaths and allow those things you don't need anymore to fall off of you. Quit holding on to the pieces that don't fit you anymore. Let them fall off. Just let them go. But once I start doing that, what will be left of me? Only the very best pieces of you. I'm so scared of changing. I keep telling you, you aren't changing. You are becoming. Becoming who? Becoming who I created you to be, a person of light and love and charity and hope and courage, a person of joy and mercy and grace and compassion. I made you for more than the shallow pieces you've decided to adorn yourself with, that you cling to with such greed and fear. Let those things fall off of you. I love you. Don't change. Become. Become who I made you to be. I'm going to keep telling you this until you remember it. Oh no, there goes another piece. Yep, let it be. So I'm not broken? Of course not. But you are breaking like the dawn. It's a new day. Become. Can I invite you to sit with that word Tirith this week and ask God to feed you, to nourish you, to school you in soul making, to reorient your perspective, to birth something new. And for those of you who maybe are looking for that fixed point of reference, who are looking to Jesus, can I just invite you to pray with me? I'd love to pray with you. God, I just thank you that you have promised to be present with us in our lostness, in our loneliness. You've promised to be that point of reference when everything has changed, when we're wandering aimlessly and we don't know which direction to go. So I pray for those who are watching today, who are longing for a fixed point of reference. Those today who want to say, yes, I would like Jesus to be my fixed point of reference. Holy Spirit, would you just fill them with a sense of your presence right now? Would you be real to them? Would you be that fixed point of reference? And so if that's you today, would you just call out to Jesus? Would you just say, Jesus, I want to follow you. Please come and fill my life today. Amen. And please text us. We'd love to walk with you on this journey. Have a great week.
Thank you, Robin, for that incredible message. What stuck out to me the most was that idea of Tirith and on letting God provide. But if this morning you're in a different place, if you're feeling 80 feet off the path, you're this close, but you can't find your fixed point, here are some ways this week that maybe you could try to find a fixed point in your life. You could join one of our small groups. Our small groups start every week, and they are there to encourage and equip you in life in this season. You can reach out and ask about Celebrate Recovery if this season and feelings of lostness have brought up new addictions or old addictions and there's things you want to deal with. Our Celebrate Recovery team is here for you. Or if to find a fixed point, you decided today that you wanted to follow Jesus, would you text HOPE to 226-400-2189? And we would be happy to connect with you today about that and offer you some more next steps in following Jesus. So from all of us at Lakeside, thank you for making us a part of your day. We hope you have an incredible week. We'll see you next Sunday, and God bless.